Please welcome back to the stage your host, John Sopel.
He's in the building. He is here. He has got a microphone on. Ladies and gentlemen, our Secretary of State for Defence, Ben Wallace.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, John.
I hate it when I make an interview plan and then I have to rip it up. This weekend, I ripped up the interview plan that I had for talking to you. I do want to talk about Ukraine and the state of things as they are, but you have just now delivered your final statement in the Commons. What was it like?
Well, it was the Defence Command Paper Refresh, so it was moving defence forward, it was incorporating the lessons of Ukraine and, you know, trying to pave the way for whatever comes next in defence spending and making sure that we're match fit for the future.
And we'll come on to the wider issues. So, I mean, You are still Secretary of State for Defence, aren't you?
Today.
Because there's a rumour.
There's a rumour there's a reshuffle tomorrow or the day after. Yeah.
In which case, this will be your last hurrah.
In that case, I'll just be over there in the seating with everyone else.
Why did you decide that you'd had enough?
Well, there's a man over there that slightly inspires me to go on your own terms. I think I'd done 4 years. I'd done 3 years as security minister. That's 7 years of sort of 24/7. It hadn't been quiet on my watch. So 2017 terrorist attacks, WannaCry, Salisbury poisoning and security. And then we did the refresh of contest and all that. And then defence has never really stopped. And ultimately, I wasn't going to stand at the next election. I think it's only fair to the sitting Prime Minister that he goes into the next election with a Defence Secretary that's not going to say 6 weeks before I'm off. And I wanted to, sort of go on my terms. And I think it is probably really important for the mental health of myself and my family that you leave on a high.
But given the urgency of Ukraine and the fast unfolding events and your centrality in involvement, were you not tempted to stay on until the general election because it is such a vital job at this moment?
When I was in the army, people used to say there's always another operational tour. You can always stay on for one more operational tour and one more and one more. And you used to see people basically exhausted and also, they came to the end like everyone else and it was sort of, there is no more tour in the end. And I never did anything without thinking about the wider team I have. I have a really good team of civil servants, of military leaders. I've appointed all the chiefs now. Continuity matters. I've appointed new DG, Director Generals in the department, the PUS, nearly all the leadership of defence I've appointed. And, in the end, someone else will take it. I think President Lincoln said the cemetery is full of indispensable men. Ultimately, the momentum is with Ukraine. It doesn't need me. I will always support it. I will do my best. There's lots of other ways to influence it, but I think it's fair to the Prime Minister that as I'm not standing, somebody else takes the realm.
Did Rishi Sunak try to dissuade you?
I think he was a bit surprised, to be honest. I think he understood the reasons. He was very understanding of the reasons when I said to him, look, I've really done my bit. I've done my time. It's time to move on. So I think, he understood the reasons and, he's a Prime Minister that wants to fight the next election. So,
And the rumours about the reshuffle tomorrow, you wouldn't have said that, I don't think, unless you thought there was some strength to the...
Well, the rumours go... It depends who you talk to at the top of government. I spoke to one very senior member of the civil service who said it's definitely happening this week. I spoke to a very senior member of the government minister who said it's not going to happen this week. But it's going to happen, right? It's going to happen either this week or the first week of September. And that's just the way it is.
What about the toxicity of politics, the kind of social media scrutiny? There was some story about you yesterday, which you replied to very amusingly.
It was the Hunt saboteurs said I was having an affair with Liz Truss and doing copious amounts of cocaine. And they're not linked as an observation, by the way. And I just replied, I'm surprised you didn't identify me as coming from the planet Krypton or something. Sometimes these people are so ludicrous, you just have to sort of... I was sort of toying with them. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't have done, but... Is politics more toxic? I think it's harder in the media. I think sensationalism is trumping truth more and more across mainstream media. And I spend a large part of my time, maybe too much, correcting things that just exhaust you. There are mainstream media who write things that it's just rubbish, right? It's not true. That's exhausting. Mainstream media, social media is, there's a lot of hate out there on social media. It's rather sad that that's a reflection of society, but also there are good people out there as well.
But do you think that will affect the quality of the politicians we get? Maybe this isn't a pejorative thing to say, but I would say in this cabinet, you kind of stood out as one of the grown-ups, as sort of, not here today, gone tomorrow.
No, I think probably politics' dirty secret is that the number of people applying to be MPs across all parties is much lesser than it was 20, 30 years ago. I remember safe Tory seats would have 600 applicants. A friend of mine from the North West Labour Party said a few years ago that a really solid Labour seat, they had less than 100 applicants. They had 20 or 30. Now, go back 30 years, never would have happened. And I think there is an effect on people wanting to do it. And the demands of the public, of the media, of the people who are there to serve, but also of all the other people around politics are such that it is a 24/7 job. And I was taught a long time ago, I think by Ken Clarke, you know, you've got at least 4 masters. You've got your association, your constituents, the government or the party, and you've got your family. And you will never please more than 2 of them at any one time. And, you know.
The other suggestion about you going was that you were pretty fed up, angry even, at not getting the NATO job as Secretary General.
No, I never set out to be Secretary General of NATO. I set out to do what I've been doing on defence. It was a sort of nice to have, you know, Mark Rutte we thought was going to be the next Secretary General, and he made it very clear, I think early in the year, that he wasn't going to put his name forward. And I think President Biden had on 2 occasions talked to him about it, either this year or last year. So when that became an opportunity, I thought, well, that would be something good to do, time to exit my time here. But it wasn't something I'd harboured in me for 10, 20 years. I think I could have done it. I think I would have understood the wheels that are required. But there are plenty of other candidates. And I think that the Americans probably wanted a head of state. If I have a theory, I think they thought 31 members, what they really want is the next prime minister or president.
So do you think it was the Americans who blocked you?
If you think the electorate of the Tory party MPs are a curious bunch, the 31 nations of NATO with no process, no ballot, no one ever declares actually that they want to be a candidate. That's the first puzzle. So who knows how it worked. There were obviously competing views, but I think it was interesting. I got on very well with the French. I was with President Macron the week before. Actually, I'd be very aligned to some of how France feels about the future direction of NATO and European defence and investing in our defence and questioning some of the things. And I think people just take people at face value. I don't think they ask the details.
Did the Prime Minister give enough of a push?
No, he did.
Because I've read that the French blackballed you, the Americans blackballed you.
I don't think we got...
Rishi Sunak blackballed you?
No, Rishi Sunak really worked hard on it. I looked at all the readouts from all his bilateral meetings. You know, I can't thank him enough for trying, and he really raised it on a number of occasions, direct with everything from the president to his interlocutors. I had quite a lot of support from lots of people, but you know, there is ultimately a question about, you know, I suppose who's going to lead an organisation of 31, and I suspect they wanted a head of state. And then, of course, you get into the other power blocks of the EU, Europe, Atlantic, positions on China, positions on Russia, hawkish, not hawkish. I mean, we heard the stories about it's time for a female head of NATO. That's great. Of course, you also want somebody who's going to spend 2%, right? So suddenly you get down to Eastern European women, the brilliant Prime Minister of Estonia, and of course they're too hawkish for potentially the Germans or the French. So suddenly you start getting into this sort of a wiring diagram that doesn't seem to please anyone. So I did say at one stage, well, we should all just get used to the Secretary General from Iceland. I mean, poor old Jens is doing a 3-year job over 10 years. I mean, it's just impossible for anyone to move on.
So let us move on to the substantive issues of NATO and what is happening in Ukraine. I suppose the one thing that has happened that, you know, I think it was Emmanuel Macron who was saying that NATO was brain dead, and no one would say that now. It's found its reason to be in a way that was unimaginable prior to the invasion by Russia of Ukraine. Is NATO in a stronger position? And we hear about the fraying of NATO unity. What is more remarkable in your mind, the fraying or the extent of the unity?
Well, first of all, NATO has worked. Throughout this war, an ever more aggressive President Putin with constant threatening red lines that usually then melt away, he hasn't dared go near NATO. Russia has been very, very cautious of respecting NATO's territory. We have not seen, you know, lashings out into the areas like Estonia or Latvia. They have been absolutely considerate of Russia, of NATO. We've seen provocation in the air, you know, a Russian aircraft going into airspace, but they have been really, really cautious to make sure that they don't provoke. So you could argue the alliance in itself functions, the deterrent of Article 5 functions. But Macron wasn't that wrong, right? Is that post-1991, NATO had just like stagnated, right? So all the things that used to be really important at NATO, such as common standards, so we all buy the right type of shell or the right type of caliber missile or whatever it is, didn't matter, you could fire them from your own platforms, all of that had started to drift. So back in the Cold War, every bridge in Europe had to be able to take 40-ton vehicles so that you could move your armoured vehicles. That had all gone. I mean, at one stage I worked out that large parts of our armour were just defeated by a bridge because people had given up a long time ago and just built whatever they wanted. So that common standard, the working out of moving vehicles around Europe on railways, it all just gone quiet, gone dead. Many populations in Europe would have been surprised that NATO was a nuclear alliance. They'd just forgotten to talk about it. And so it didn't have plans to do what happens if. They had just died, really. And now we see regional plans, which I think 4,000 pages of very detailed plans of what happens in scenario B. We've seen a reinvigoration of what NATO needs and the Supreme Allied Commander needs to do its job, and new domains.
And the counter-offensive, is it making progress?
It is. It is making progress. It's making hundreds of meters a day, sometimes a little less than 300-400, sometimes a little more.
I heard one of the leading Ukrainian generals saying it's not going as fast as we would.
It's not. Funny enough, there's quite a lot of history here. If you look at US generals and British generals in the Second World War, Patton would often complain about the speed of British advance. But it was an advance. And the Ukrainians are having to learn on the job capabilities that they didn't really have. Combat engineering and the way they configure their forces is not how we do it in the West. In the West, we have combat engineers quite deeply into our organization. These are people that lay mines, lay bridges, remove obstacles, cross obstacles. They don't quite have that in the Soviet army originally. So they are learning as they go. The Russians are just throwing mines everywhere. That, of course, slows it down. But what I would say is the Ukrainians have not committed their reserves yet, so they haven't gone all in. They are still advancing, albeit slowly, on 3 fronts, east and 2 in the sort of southwest. They will inevitably make a decision on which is the axis, and then they'll commit their reserves. So it is not yet worryingly slow. It is just brave men and women having to fight their way through minefields, and a Russia that, if you remember, doesn't care about its own. It's got a big meat grinder. But what was interesting about Prigozhin and his dash to Moscow was it demonstrated Russia doesn't have much of a reserve. The fact he could drive 200 kilometers within range of Moscow and no one stopped him showed there isn't much left of the Russian army.
Has the West been too slow, or maybe the better phrase is behind the curve, in supplying Ukraine what it needs? And you kind of, you take the debate back a year, well, we're not going to supply that, and then 6 months later you are, and there's still the debate over, F-16s. So we're going to train pilots to fly F-16s, and will F-16s be in the theatre there?
I think the charge of being too slow could be applied before the invasion. Between 2014 and the invasion, there should have been a much greater effort to lethally equip Ukraine. It was very few of us. We were the first Europeans, and that was only a month before. The Americans had put in javelins, but had sort of effectively secured the javelins. They were in country, but they weren't free distribution. But once it started, there was sort of debates about could they have tanks earlier, could they have done things. I'm not so sure. I mean, what we've always tried to do is give them the effects they require. So a fighter plane is a good example. A fighter plane does 3 things. It does anti-air, it shoots down other aircraft. It does combat support, so it supports troops in the field. And then it does deep strike, so it hits targets like headquarters 300-400 kilometers away. We've managed to give them all those capabilities in a different manner. So the Storm Shadow missile hits in the deep, 200-300 kilometers away, the target. The HIMARS did 80 kilometers. The handheld, and now we've got Patriots, anti-aircraft missiles, they can shoot down other Russian planes, and they do. And then the close air support, interestingly enough, opens up a question for ourselves, which is one of the highest attrition rates of the Russian attack helicopters, right? Because they're really vulnerable. So what you see on the front line is a lot of use of drones, dropping hand grenades, or sort of one up from that, doing a similar job to supporting troops in the field. So I don't think, if we'd given everything on day one, it would have all been brilliant, and it would have been much, much better. Because also people have to learn to fight and use them. I remember when HIMARS and the M270s were introduced, the initial instinct of some of the Ukrainians was to use them in the same way they used them in the Soviet army. Well, they'd have run out. They'd have run out in about a week, right? These are precision munitions that need to be targeted precisely, and you need to triage when you use it, when you don't. If you use a precision mission, you know, if you've only got so many missiles and you use it against a tank, you'll run out.
Do you think this war is winnable, and winnable by which I mean that Russia leaves all Ukrainian territory, the Crimea, the Donbass, etc.?
I think it is winnable. I think Russia is much more fragile than people want. Well, the Russians want to admit, for sure. I mean, if you look at the generals being fired, you look at Prigozhin. You know, if anyone predicted last year that Prigozhin was going to march on Moscow, General Surovikin, who is currently resting in Moscow at the moment, he's one of their most capable generals, right? So the splinter in the hierarchy of the Russian army is very real. The casualty rates are horrendous. I mean, it would not be wrong to say at least 230, 250,000 dead or injured Russians. Now, in 10 years in Afghanistan...
And I think I'm right, the British Army is 82,000 people?
It's 100,000, if you add the reserves, it's about 110,000. In 10 years of Afghanistan, they lost 15,000 men. So that is the mindset of Putin. I mean, you have to ask yourself, and one of the things that I felt way back when this came to be the issue, and I first went to Ukraine in 2016 as security minister. I remember thinking something had changed when Putin used nerve agent at Salisbury. That was the real wake-up call, that this was a man who supposedly had been on a journey from the Soviet Union, authorizing the use of a banned substance, nerve agent, on the streets of a county town without any real regard. I remember going to see the discarded perfume bottle, which was 98% pure. It would have killed 3,000-4,000 people if it had been distributed differently. It had just been chucked under a bush in a park. We went to a small park in Salisbury, and I went with the chief constable and the head of terrorism. And he was saying, I'll show you where it is. And there was a man sitting on the bench eating his sandwiches. And these policemen and spooks were pointing at the bench he was sitting on. And he looked up, and I thought, I can't tell him. But I think that is an example of that would have come from the top. And when you see that, someone's making that decision in a NATO country, things had changed, the rules had changed. And one of my battles between then and lethally arming Ukraine was persuading parts of our system that the game of chess had already begun, right? Putin was doing this. You know, I remember saying in one meeting, a security meeting, you know, the game's afoot, right? The game of chess has begun. Either you're going to play to a draw or a checkmate, and half the system didn't want, oh, no, nothing's begun. Well, it had begun.
And China? How worried should we be about an increasingly militarized China?
I think the thing we should worry most about China is inexperience. In its military and its diplomacy, you'll often see it goes from 0 to 100 really quickly. There's no, I mean, if you remember in COVID, Australia made a comment about wanting a WHO investigation. And Chinese state media immediately briefed that Australia was the gum on their shoe and immediately went into attack mode. And diplomacy is supposed to be graduated. Military response is about experience. And I think, first of all, we should worry that an emerging, more assertive China doesn't yet have that experience, and that could lead to miscalculation. Secondly, we need to have a proper political plan in the West. I don't mean unilaterally as Britain, but how do we deal with greater competition, with aggressive attacks on sovereignty in the South China Sea and freedom of navigation and theft of fishing grounds and all those things that cause regional dispute in the Pacific between the Philippines and the Vietnamese and everyone else, and Taiwan as well. And I think I'm not yet sure we see a mature political plan from the West of how to actually do what we want to do to avoid any conflict is to say, how do we change your behaviour? What do we want China to do differently? And how do we indicate how to do it?
I'm going to end where I started, which is you. So what are you going to do next?
I don't know. I mean, I joked about working in a bar. I mean,
I reckon you'd get a job.
I was a ski instructor. I was trying to work out if I could work from home in a ski instructor in my last 2 months in Parliament. I'm going to, I live up in Cumbria, Lancashire. I'm going to go back up there. I'm going to do what I started. I'm going to finish off my political time going to see my farmers and my schools and all that sort of thing, because I think that is important. And then I'll explore. And yeah, I mean, anyone got any job offers? Unless you're from Undercover Panorama, where you try. But I've had a very nice offer from some dodgy South African firm already, who I don't think probably exists. I think I'll take my time. I think what I do.
Well, good luck with whatever comes next. And as they say in the United States of America, where I was based for a long time, thank you for your service. Ben Wallace, thank you. Thank you. Well, we just touched briefly on the fact that, of course, the dominant power in the world is still the United States, but the tension between it and China is growing steadily, and the impact of that relationship, good or bad, has huge ramifications, and that's what we're going to consider now. We're going to hear in a moment from Jude Blanchett, who holds the Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. But first, let's hear from TBI's Ruby Osman. Ruby.
Hi everyone. Tensions between the US and China have the potential to impact a wide range of the UK's domestic and foreign policy. It's what ChatGPT told me when I asked why the UK needs to be paying more attention to the US-China relationship. But ChatGPT has a point. It's impossible to speak about the future of the UK without thinking about how the relationship between those two major powers could fundamentally alter the landscape we operate in. And amid all this talking of decoupling and de-risking, the UK needs to start doing some smart thinking on what could come next. For example, we're not the only ones going to the polls next year. Elections in India, in Taiwan, across the EU, and most of all in the US, are going to see voters putting a spotlight like never before on the different ways we engage with China. And then there's Taiwan itself. Taiwan produces 90% of the most advanced semiconductor chips, and last year more than 80% of large shipping containers passed through the Taiwan Strait. An escalation in tensions would not only be disastrous for the people of Taiwan, we'd feel it here in our pockets in the UK far more than war in Ukraine. And even ChatGPT itself is something the UK needs to be paying attention to. Is AI set to accelerate tensions between major powers? Or could it be a rare opportunity to come together and start setting some guardrails? The UK is going to need to figure out where it wants to sit within all of this. We have had a lot of China policy by soundbite. The challenge now is going to be starting to articulate in concrete terms exactly what it is we want from our relationship with China and how that fits with a broader vision of the UK's place in the world. How do we best lean into our traditional alliances with the EU and the US when they don't always see eye to eye on China? And what new partnerships do we need to build resilience for the next decade? Whether that's with other G7 members like Japan and Australia, or across Southeast Asia and the Global South. These are obviously some big questions to try and answer in 3 minutes. But luckily, in a moment, we will be joined by someone even smarter than ChatGPT, the fantastic Jude Blanchett from CSIS. But before that, we're best placed to talk about our future when we learn from those who've shaped our past. That's why we wanted to put some of these big picture questions to someone with more years' experience in this than both Jude and I combined. Thank you. Dr. Kissinger, thank you for joining us today to look at what's happening in the US-China relationship and what it means for countries in the middle to navigate some of those tensions. But first of all, I just wanted to start by taking a bit of a step back. We've seen a lot of people likening the current situation, the current tensions, to a new Cold War. But as someone who was in the room watching a lot of the original Cold War unfold, what do you make of that comparison?
When I started getting involved in China relationship, we had had no contact with China for 25 years as a government, and very few private people. So I had the conventional view that China was very similar to the Soviet Union. And one of my experiences in dealing with China now over more than 50 years is that they represent a distinct culture, has great continuity and survival ability. So in the process, I had to adjust my own thinking. At first, we thought of China as a balancing element against the Soviet Union. Now we find ourselves in a world where Russia and the Soviet and China, close allies publicly anyway. So that's a new situation. When we started relations with China, the Chinese economy was that of a developing country. Now it is considered
talk about the U.S.-China relationship, but here I am. It's a real pleasure to be here, find the time. I've been given the straightforward task of explaining the entirety of the U.S.-China relationship and all its complexities in 14 minutes and 38 seconds. So I want to do my best, but it's a real honor. I really appreciate Tony Blair's invitation and TBI and all the staff. In all seriousness, what I wanted to do with the balance of time and picking up on some of the themes that were mentioned in that fantastic interview is lay out what I see as the trajectory China is taking and what are the key features of the US-China relationship. I think Ruby put it well that this is a conference about the future of Britain, but it is hard to think about the trajectory of any of the issues discussed earlier today without understanding how those could clash or be affected by the sort of entanglement of the US and China in this current geopolitical moment. I want to start with, and I gave away the thesis in the title of this, which is as we watch the United States and China engage with each other and increasingly in contentious ways in a number of domains, we're searching for a heuristic or a framework to make sense of this. And it is seductive and I think quite understandable that one of the analogies we're reaching for is this a new Cold War? And if we think about the broad parameters of the US-China relationship, I understand why this is the metaphor that we're looking for. These are two superpowers with distinct and in many ways antagonistic political systems. This is a global competition. This spans the military, technological, economic domains. But there, I think the parallels between the first Cold War and the current US-China relationship end. This is 2023, and I think we heard in the last interview a question by Ruby saying that really the challenges that confront the UK, but the United States and democracies globally are vastly different from those that we confronted in the 20th century, even as we feel some of the legacies and indeed some of the challenges of the 20th century, like major power war, in front of us today. But this is not 1947, this is not 1968, this is not 1991, and Beijing is not Moscow. The global community will not fracture into blocks. The United States attempt under the Biden administration early on to create a movement of democracies versus autocracies ran out of gas once it confronted some of the realities of geopolitics in the 21st century. And indeed, the old playbook of the Cold War doesn't always help us when we think about the United States and China, countries which are, as of today, as historically linked in terms of aggregate two-way trade as they have ever been, with last year's bilateral trade being at historic levels. And if we think about the parallel between Beijing and Moscow, China is now the largest trading partner of 120 countries, something Moscow never got remotely close to. This does not mean China is not a challenge, quite the opposite. And in many ways, I think China presents more of a formidable challenge than did the Soviet Union, but this is why it demands creative thinking. And we won't help ourselves as democracies if we think we can simply read the speeches of George Kennan or look back at how we navigated the Cuban Missile Crisis and think that is necessarily going to be an effective blueprint moving forward. One of the key reasons why, as I alluded to before, why the Cold War metaphor does not always work is the simple fact of fundamental technological and economic interdependencies that exist in a globalized world in 2023, which were not present in the 20th century. China is entering into a phase of lower growth. This is undeniable, and in many ways, this was inevitable, given that the rapid growth China experienced starting in the late 1970s up until about the 2010-2011 period was unsustainable. But even China growing at a much slower annual GDP grows off of a massive economic base. And so I think we have to set in our heads that China will be with us for the foreseeable future, especially when we think about not legacy industries, but industries of the future. I have a few quickly Googled statistics here to highlight one of these issues which has come to prominence over the past several weeks as we've had new data about China's emergence as an electric vehicle superpower. But this is across the board in what we would broadly call green tech. Xi Jinping is laser focused on channeling industrial policy and financial resources to make China a global leader in these industries of the future. So 80% of the world's solar panels, accounting for 35% of electric car exports. And as we've seen in China's successes in industrial policy and battery technology, we're going to have to move out of our head the framework of China as a sort of slowing economy that is losing its relevance, or indeed, I would say, collapse. I've been working on China for 20 years, so I've been present for prediction of 20 of the last 0 collapses of China. But yet again, we're in another wave of this as we think about the clear, undeniable challenges China faces. But we very immediately leap to this view that China is therefore, the China story is over. And I think we have to get comfortable that it is here. And so I think this is a good starting point for some of the challenges that face us as democracies think about crafting, enduring, effective, sustainable China strategies. It starts with a pillar of recognizing China's centrality, but I should say it also starts with a recognition of the trajectory that China is on politically, which is under the current leadership of Xi Jinping, I would say inexorably moving towards a more autocratic, militaristic position. Those two pillars, though, mean that simple solutions that you hear won't cut it. So the new Cold War paradigm, I think, doesn't capture the interdependencies of the 21st century global economy. But then again, the old model of engagement with China, if we talk our way, we can talk our way to a solution with Beijing, don't fit the muscular, nationalist, assertive, and confident China of Xi Jinping. So the question then is, what do we do about it? This is not the platform, and it would be far too typically American to sit up in here and tell the UK what they should do on China. But here are, I think, some of the emergent conclusions we've reached or now reaching in the United States. One is find the right objective for a China policy. And in some ways, that might be looking beyond China itself and thinking about how China fits into a broader, more affirmative strategy. Although I just said this is not a new Cold War, permit me quoting from arguably the architect of US Cold War strategy, George Kennan, where in the final paragraphs of his long telegram concluded, quote, "We, the United States, must formulate and put forward for other nations a much more positive and constructive picture of the sort of world we would like to see than the one we have put forward in the past. It is not enough to urge the people to develop political processes similar to our own. Many foreign peoples are seeking guidance rather than responsibilities." So this, in the document of Cold War strategy, focusing on containment of the Soviet Union, was saying actually we need to look beyond the Soviet Union as we think about an objective strategy to deal with the Soviet Union if we're to be effective. And the second point I would say is the challenge of prioritization. One of the features you will notice in US debate on China is an existential challenge everywhere and always. And that makes crafting good policy difficult if you can't prioritize where does China interact with our interests that are fundamentally at odds and we need to prioritize, and where do we have to cede ground to China, not because we necessarily agree with it, but because we have our own sort of bigger fish to fry and strategy to implement. And of course, the other point in a sustainable China strategy is a vision of engagement with China. Engagement, a dirty word now in the United States, but I'm hard-pressed to think of what other word we would use when we are facing the existential reality that China is coupled with us. As I was saying to someone earlier, it's a little bit like having a peeing section in a swimming pool to think that we are going to cut China out of discussions on AI standards development. China is developing AI, so what are we going to do about it? If we think about public health, one of the conclusions many have reached on COVID is China is not a good faith actor in public health. I think there's some clear truth to that given the opacity of its political system, but viruses don't respect nation-state boundaries. So we are coupled with China when we think about public health. Let's think about climate. We are coupled with China when we think about solutions to climate and indeed the changing climate. So a Cold War and Cold War style blocs don't find answers to some of these challenges where we are inextricably coupled with China. And so that gets me to my last point, and arguably one of the most worrying and depressing, and one that Dr. Kissinger mentioned, which is, does any of that matter? And what is the prospect for a sustainable China strategy when we feel like we're entering into a moment of either 1914 or 1941? And indeed, I think this is something that is occupying almost all of the political discussion in China strategy in the United States right now. To answer my own rhetorical question, of course war is not inevitable. Leaders have agency and are not prisoner to structural forces or the march of time or history, even if we do have to respect those structural forces. But the solution in finding a path to avoid conflict requires hugging the cactus of just how contentious this flashpoint is right now. Dr. Kissinger alluded to this, but we have this issue now which is at the very heart of US-China relations, and it's hard to gain traction on any issue because we have this potentially existential threat looming just offshore. And so part of the challenge for all of us, and that includes everyone in this room, is finding a new modus vivendi that can push off the prospect of this conflict. And I should say this is a flashpoint. This is not a new flashpoint. We have been managing this flashpoint for 70 years. The issue of Taiwan has been central to the US-China relationship and has been the closest we've come to nuclear war after 1945 over the issue of Taiwan. It's also, I should stress, and as I just alluded to, not just a US-China issue, even if they are the chief antagonists or protagonists. The effects of a conflict or even heightened tensions over the issue of Taiwan would be unavoidable for any country, including the United Kingdom. You've likely heard these statistics ad nauseum, but it bears repeating. A conflict over Taiwan would be a conflict between the first, second, and 16th largest economies directly. And in the case of that 16th largest economy, Taiwan, that number 16, I think, belies the actual importance of Taiwan, which is 35% of automotive chips and 70% of handheld device chips come from one single firm in TSMC. So a conflict or a crisis in the Taiwan Strait would have catastrophic global repercussions. Even as many think they can sit on the side and watch this and hope that this is solved, this is really a global challenge, and one where I think the United Kingdom is much to sort of, I think the hope of many that it could be avoided is a central player. So looking at time and seeing I have about a minute left, let me wrap up by saying it may feel like there are strong convictions and answers coming out of the United States on what to do on China. I've heard this a number of times over the past few days. I would say that we're really at the nascent point of thinking about this challenge. This is one where the United States is starting to recognize it is no longer in a period where it can drive unilateral strategy on China. This is, given the global interdependencies that the United States faces as much as China and the United Kingdom do, one where policy from the West will be forged coalitionally, even if the United States doesn't always recognize it. And on many of the hard issues, whether that's Taiwan, technology, human rights, values, the United States needs answers from partners, close partners like the United Kingdom. So I look forward to having this important conversation with comrades here in the United Kingdom, and thank you very much for your time.
There has been a lot of talk today about governance and governing. So it's my honour now to introduce our next speaker, who hopes to be forming the next government in the United Kingdom, Sir Keir Starmer, and in a moment he will be speaking to Tony Blair himself after Keir Starmer has laid out his vision. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, John. It's such a pleasure to be here today, and I'm really grateful for the invitation. And Tony, thank you personally for the invitation and for all the support that you've given me since I've been Labour leader. But most of all, for the work that you do here at the Tony Blair Institute. And I've been back at HQ today working on the by-elections, but I've heard report after report about just how good today has been, the ideas coming out of it. And that is absolutely what you'd expect, because the Institute is always, as you would expect, relentlessly focused on the future. Draws deeply on what's happening beyond our shores, we just heard that, the very best in public policy innovation. But it remains grounded in a fierce commitment to this country and a burning belief that we can be better. Now, sadly at the moment, that optimism is becoming a faintly heretical belief. But today I want to set out a defence of that position and explain how my Labour Party is crafting a political project and programme that can deliver it. It begins with a single-minded purpose: to fight the pernicious idea that background equals destiny, shatter what I call the class ceiling, and build a country where you don't have to change who you are just to get on, and where families believe, with the certainty that they deserve, that the future will be better for their children. That's my politics. It's my story, and for me, it's also the driving force of progressive politics, the currency of our hope. But by anyone's standards, that's in short supply at the moment. I think everyone knows, you've been discussing it all day, that there are enormous challenges. The in-tray of the next government will be like none other. And without decisive leadership, it will gnaw away at our collective sense of collective purpose and push us towards a learned political hopelessness, a mindset of decline. Now, to be honest, it's impossible to list all of the challenges. We'd be here all day. There's the cost of living crisis, of course, and climate change, a recipe for long-term global instability. An ageing society, the biggest change in who we are since the Industrial Revolution. Artificial intelligence, a technology that will, there's no doubt about this, reshape our economy and quickly. The changing balance of power in the world and an unforgiving global race, not just for jobs, but also for the new materials and supply chains needed to sustain prosperity in this changing world. And then, as if that wasn't enough, on top of it, we have the mess of the last 13 years. A botched Brexit deal that strangled our economic dynamism. A mortgage bombshell that will blow up British home ownership. Infrastructure starved of investment. Wages totally flat. Public services on their knees. The worst period for British productivity since Napoleon. Make no mistake, it's a new age of insecurity. And we're not even close to match fit. So we've got to get back on our feet, join the race, win the race, and get our future back. We need three things: growth, growth, growth. Now, you may have heard a refrain a bit like that before. But I'm serious. It's the only answer that can restore long-term hope and opportunity. We need to rebuild the foundations of our economy, fundamentally change Britain's growth model. Growing the economy, and crucially how you do it, that is the central question. And not just here in Britain, for progressives everywhere. The biggest barrier to our purpose of lifting working people up. Now, it actually helps to think about this politically. It simplifies things. Because when progressives win, they do so with a fairly universal argument. And it runs like this: that we will deliver, no matter how volatile the external world, security for your family, for your community, and for our country. And from that strong foundation, guaranteed by a dynamic state with world-class public services, your aspirations can flourish, success can be realised, and you can get on. Get on in a growing and stable economy that creates new opportunities, pays for that strong foundation, and, where necessary, the redistribution needed to tackle injustice. That's our argument, and when we convince on it, we win. But when we forget elements, when we forget security or aspiration, wealth creation or economic stability, then yes, we lose. But we also lose when we stop persuading new people to our argument. That's what I mean by project. Who do we need to convince again? And for my Labour Party, for me, after the collapse in Scotland in 2015, the loss of the Red Wall in 2019, and the divisions of the Brexit years, the project is to return Labour to the service of working people, to become once again the natural vehicle for their hopes and aspirations across all 4 nations of these islands. It's not the only path a progressive party could take. There are other directions. The rabbit hole of narrow identity politics. That's not a new thing, but it's always there. You could even completely unmoor from the concerns of working people. That sounds ridiculous to me, but some people did seriously suggest it after the Brexit referendum. But no, I am completely convinced that reconnecting with working people is the right path. Not just because I feel it in my bones, although I do, but also because it forces us to confront the realities of the country and its challenges more starkly. Most of all on, you guessed it, growth. Because the central reason progressive parties around the world have struggled to connect to working people isn't anything to do with woke. That's a distraction on both sides of politics. It's rather that an underlying assumption of the traditional argument that growth would be distributed evenly across a country and its people has, when faced with the headwinds of globalization and technology, collapsed. But also that whilst redistribution will always be a tool in our box, it can't be a one-word plan for everywhere outside the southeast. That's not enough on its own to persuade people, working people, that the traditional argument still holds. And so, we don't convince. That's why growth in every community is the oxygen of our ambitions, totally central to our programme, our 5 national missions. It is, of course, a mission in its own right, the highest sustained growth in the G7. That's our goal. But the other 4, clean electricity by 2030, an NHS fit for the future, safer streets in our communities, and shattering the class ceiling, they all require growth, and they all support growth. Now, to meet all these challenges, the British state needs fundamental reform. That's why our mission-driven government, is a new approach to the state. It's about the how as well as the what. A new way of governing that draws on a deep body of work. It does mean breaking down silos, joining up services, power out of Whitehall, a total rewiring. But also a new mindset when it comes to what we think government is capable of. A total rejection of the short-term sticking plaster outlook that can't focus on the future. that washes its hands and says, no, we won't intervene on behalf of businesses and working people. Take technology. I totally accept the optimistic message of this conference on the role it can play in public services. You can see that in our reform plans. The work Jonathan Ashworth is doing on how artificial intelligence can deliver quicker, more responsive services in Job Centre Plus. Where's Streeting's commitment to use it to improve diagnostic speed and accuracy for diseases like cancer? Or Bridget Phillipson's plans to finally crack the code on digital skills and weave them through a new skills curriculum. Technology can be a game changer. There's no question about that. But look, there'll be no technological revolution in our public services unless we have an economy that is open to that, with new institutions that can crowd in new investment, and a government that takes seriously our reputation, our global standing in everything that it does, that truly believes you need dynamic government to seize the opportunities of the future. No, to be a careful steward of the economy in a volatile world, to grow the economy through difficult times, you need to be proactive. That's the lesson staring us in the face. The stand-aside state can't cope with the world in front of us, where other countries don't behave in the way market dogma expects, where global supply chains can be weaponized by tyrants, and where, for working people, trickle-down growth means power trickles up and jobs trickle out. So in short, on the road back to hope and opportunity, the signpost is labelled growth. Growth for our purpose, growth for our project, growth for our programme, a new growth model for Britain that accepts the imperative of economic stability, but still charts a new course, that modernises our public services, invests in the industries of the future, gives communities control, backs science, enterprise and our universities, reforms our broken labour market, reskills the nation, restores our standing, and bulldozes through the planning laws that hold our future back. A long-term plan for long-term prosperity. But finally, one place where I do take issue with Tony, the idea that this is somehow beyond left and right. No, for me, this is a progressive moment, because on the right, all I see is retreat. Retreat from the world, retreat from the battle of ideas, retreat from the necessary fight against their dangerous fringe. On the other, all around the world, I see progressive parties asking the difficult questions, looking for new ways to express that traditional argument, going for growth. That, in the end, is the only way to break Britain out of its current doom loop and deliver our purpose. It will require political courage, hard choices, and an unbending urgency on reform. But it's the path we choose. The builders, not the blockers. Renewal, not decline. In place of stagnation, growth. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I think we're going here. Hi. You good? Which one are you? Am I here? Fantastic.
Well, this is a first. So, thank you very much indeed for coming. I'm really, really grateful. Thank you so much for the speech. Before we get on to the substance, how are you enjoying Prime Minister's questions?
I'm a bit out of practice.
But he's not turning up.
I haven't seen him for 3 weeks. We got one tomorrow, and then I think only 2 more before conference. So, yeah, I think he's more than anyone else.
Yeah, that's something I really don't miss, you know.
Yeah.
No, even now, wherever I am in the world, sort of midday Wednesday, I think I've got this uneasy feeling. Oh, yeah, that's what it was.
Well, I think at least you moved it from twice a week into once a week.
Yep.
So that's only on a Wednesday at 12.
It's a small number of people who should be grateful to me, but they should be very grateful.
I keep reminding the Shadow Cabinet that back in the day, the Prime Minister used to sit on the front bench and choose which of his ministers would answer the question. Yes, so we could go back to that model.
Yeah, we never know what they're going to say, though. That's the thing. Okay, so, you know, you've done an amazing job. You've taken the Labour Party in 2019. It was on the brink of extinction, frankly. And you've taken it, I know you can't say it's on the brink of government, but I think it's a pretty good prospect. And yet, I think we both agree that 1997 is very different from 2024. You know, in 1997, we had a lot of things to do, but on the other hand, we could see that growth had stabilized, and we could look forward to over 2% trend growth. What you're going to inherit next year is, I mean, as I said earlier, it's grim, right?
Yeah, it's going to be really tough. But I think this point about the mood of the country is really, really important, because now we've got to a position where we're a credible contender, and that's all we are. We've got a lot of work to do. People are looking back to when this last happened. And we've, I mean, as you know better than anyone, we've only won from opposition 3 times. And obviously 97 was the last time. And the mood then was one of growing optimism. That song, Things Can Only Get Better, that resonated because it felt that was the mood of the country at the time. The economy was growing, and you know, what Labour was able to come in and absolutely sort of turbocharge that sense that we're going to go into a new century, it's a new way of doing politics, modernising, things can only get better. That's not the position now, by a long shot. The economy is badly damaged. Public services are, I say, on their knees. My wife, who works for the NHS, would say on their face. And the mood of the country, I think, is pretty bleak. And I think many people fall into 2 camps. The camp that says to me, I like what you're saying, your missions, the change that I think you would bring about, but can you do it? Can you do it? It seems too broken to me. And then another group that say, will you do it? We've been lied to so much in the last 13 years, we don't actually believe anything anybody says. So the mood is very different. The reason it matters, I mean, it's not just a sort of historic, interesting analysis. We have to get the mood of the country right, because we have to speak to the country where it is now and not where we'd like it to be. And therefore it's a mistake to us to speak to the country as if it's 1996. We've got to speak to the country as it is in 2023.
Right, and they want a sense of realism.
Yeah. Reassurance. They want hope, of course, but the reassurance has to come first. Do you get it? Do you know how bad things are? Do you know how much I'm struggling? Can you fix the immediate problem? And can you deal with the longer-term fundamentals that we need to fix?
I mean, I'm personally a fan of the 5 missions, because here's what I think they do, which I think is really important in this context. I mean, if you take over from Rishi Sunak next year, you will be the 6th Prime Minister in 8 years. And in the previous 37 or 36, I think we had 5. So, but not only have we many prime ministers, but they've all been very different from each other, right? So David Cameron, Theresa May was very different from David Cameron. Boris Johnson was very different from Theresa May. Sunak was...
There was one in the middle there, Truss.
Oh, yeah? Well,
Easy to overlook.
Yeah, well, she was very different. Yeah. So the thing is, what that does, I think this is really important, because what that does is, it means you cannot have a consistent government policy, right?
Yeah.
So I think what is really important to me about these missions is that they set clarity of direction.
it's so important that we have mission-driven government for all those reasons. I think the single biggest failure of the last 13 years is failure to grow the economy. If we'd grown the economy in the last 13 years, as well as you grew it in the 13 years before that under the Labour government, we'd have tens of billions of pounds to spend on public services without altering tax at all. One of the reasons we haven't grown it is all that chopping and changing. And when we say we've had 3 prime ministers in the last year, 4 chancellors and 4 budgets, that is politically funny. It makes for really good cartoons. It's a disaster when it comes to investment and strategic thinking. And so part of the task we will inherit is bringing stability to government and ensuring that our projects are clear, they're focused, they're realistic, and that we stick to it over the long term and don't move around and chop and change. I've spoken, we were at Davos together, we've spoken to no end of investors who say to me, it's not that we don't have the money to invest in some of the projects in Britain that need investment, it's that we don't see the conditions of certainty right at the moment that will allow us to come alongside a government and actually deliver. And that's why the missions are strategic, long-term. They're about the what change you're going to make, growing the economy, NHS for the future, green power, smashing the class ceiling, and security in our communities, but also the how. How are you going to do this? How are you going to get business to partner alongside you and deliver on these missions? And that's why we're having a row at the moment about tough choices. Yep. Because we need the stability in our economy is absolutely vital as a stepping stone to getting onto those missions.
So when people say, look, you should be making all these spending commitments and...
Well, my first reaction, we keep saying collectively as a party, we've got to take tough decisions. And in the abstract, everyone says, that's right, Keir. And then we get a tough decision. We've been in one of those for the last few days, saying, well, I don't like that. Can we just not make that one? I'm sure there's another tough decision somewhere else that we could make. But we have to take the tough decisions. And this isn't, this isn't some sort of reflection on some focus group that says, we'd like Labour to have an economic straitjacket on. It's the fundamentals. Liz Truss was very different to others. She proved the thesis that if you make unfunded commitments, then the economy is damaged and working people pay the price.
Right, that could be tax or spending, right?
That could be tax. For her, it was unfunded tax cuts, but it could be unfunded spending. So if you want proof that unfunded commitments cause economic damage, which is then visited on working people, you've got a living example of that. And that can come from both sides of politics. And so it's a fundamental. I will not let the next Labour government get anywhere near the equivalent of what Liz Truss did. Because it will... But it is also, for that investment, we need to partner with business to get these missions done, because they're massive. They'll make a big difference to our country if we can do it. That means we have to show that the conditions of certainty are there, sufficient for them to put in their lot and come alongside us. So it's not this idea that you can either have, responsible economy or big reform is completely wrong. The only way you get the big reform is by having a secure economy. And that's the discussion that we're having internally in the Labour Party now. I'm absolutely clear about the direction of travel on this.
I mean, I think the other thing that's interesting is that, some of the... So people always say, yeah, but how are you going to do these things? But, for example, in the speech you've just given now, you mentioned planning specifically. Yep. And one of the things we've explored today at this conference is in relation, for example, to the clean energy revolution, just how planning's holding us back, right?
Yeah, completely. I spoke to the CEO of one of our big energy companies not long ago, and I said, look, just assuming for a moment that we are able to come into power and I want to get to clean electricity, clean power by 2030, how quickly could you build me an onshore wind farm? And he said, 2 years. I thought, wow, we're going to be really motoring here. So I said, well, how soon do I get power out of it? He said, oh, that'll be 13 years. I said, well, talk me through that then. He said, I'm going to lose 5 years to planning. And then even when I've done that, I said, well, we're still losing 6 years here. Where does that come from? He said, even when we've done the planning, we've got through that, then the grid will not start crawling towards me until I'm ready to switch the power on. So 13 years. We can't win the race for the next generation of jobs with that. So we're going to have to be really bold on planning and remove those impediments. And this is what I mean by mission-driven government, which is if you get elected into government with 5 missions, then you are democratically entitled to say that's the direction of travel for our country, because we put it to the country and they said we want these fundamental changes. Then got a choice as to how to do it. We could say, well, they're our missions, so we'll suck it all up to the centre and run it through government, which would be a big mistake. Or we can say, well, the missions are clear, so the private sector normally follows and the market's pretty good, so let them get on with it. That won't work. Or we can partner where we say, this is what we're trying to achieve. You are vested in helping us achieve this, and our job is to make sure the conditions are such that you can ensure that happens. So for those onshore wind farms, the job of an incoming Labour government is to say, we're going to deal with planning laws, we're going to deal with all of the problems in infrastructure that are holding this back, and through this partnership deliver, in this case an onshore wind farm, but there are plenty of other examples, and actually get ahead of, and that of course, I mean, onshore wind is not just about the climate obligations, it is the single, clean energy is the single best way to keep our bills down, to ensure that we have energy security so Putin can't put his boot on our throat, and the next generation of jobs are bound up with this. The Inflation Reduction Act in America is like a magnet for investment at the moment. The EU has responded, and this government's sitting it out. We've got to turn that around.
I mean, one of the things, obviously, is in relation to the partnership between public and private sector. I mean, I know you spend a lot of time talking to business and to the business community. Have you got from them, is there a set of things that they're looking to from government that you can identify?
Yeah. The first is stability, economic stability, because they say we're not coming near this until you're... The first thing is stability. The second is a long-term strategy. The missions are intended to be long-term. Just another, I mean, this is another wind farm example, but it serves the purpose. Whiteley is the biggest onshore wind farm in the UK. It's just outside Glasgow. There's 350 wind turbines there. It's amazing to go and see it. It's like a film set. It's incredible, on the side of the hill there. And when I went there with the CEO of Scottish Power, I looked at them. They're big, incredible pieces of manufacturing. I said, how many of these were built in the UK then? And he said, none of them. I said, well, why not? He said, because we didn't have a long-term strategy. The government wasn't clear enough, back to your point about chopping through 6 different prime ministers, and therefore the investors went elsewhere. These were all made in Indonesia, he said. And they were towed in, literally towed in to Scotland and erected there. And so the business is saying security, clear, strategic goals, and you're going to stay the course. And they've got to be the right goals.
I mean, I think this is one big difference from when we were in, because in a way, you know, that we had a situation where growth was strong, the economy was running reasonably well. I mean, obviously, there were changes that Gordon and myself made that were important, but I think there's a much greater priority now as we enter a new age industrially for that partnership between public and private sector.
Yeah. I think it's the only way we can deliver. If you look at the money that's needed to invest in clean power, you can't do it all through state funding. That's never going to get us there on time. So we need that partnership. But we need to create the conditions in which that partnership works.
Right. So health obviously is a big priority for the Labour Party, always is. You've talked about reform, Keir, and we talked today a lot about what's possible with a lot of the you know, new technology and the ability to create new treatments, to do better diagnostics, prevention and cure. How much does that fit into the plan of what you need to do with the health service?
It's central. It's absolutely central, the technology and the changes. If you take AI, I mean, you may have had this example today, but a radiologist working with AI can get us 60% more accurate diagnostics on stage 1 cancer, lung cancer, than we can without. And that is obviously very good news for the individual. but massively important for the NHS because it costs, if you don't catch it, I mean, we all know this, if you don't catch cancer till stage 4, then you're looking at a much poorer outcome for the individual and a much bigger bill for the NHS. So it's absolutely central. But this goes, on the mission on the NHS, we had to be clear, we don't just want to pick the NHS up and put it back on its feet. Of course we want to do that. But I don't want 5 years of Labour government where all we've achieved is managing slightly better the services and institutions as they now are. I want them to be materially better. And whatever the mistakes the last 13 years, and there have been many, the challenges facing the NHS are just fundamentally different now to the challenges it faced 75 years ago. And the techniques for dealing with it, technology has gone so fast, right? The AI. So that means we have the opportunity, if we take it, to create an NHS fit for the future, which is technology, it's about prevention, moving health closer to our communities. At the moment, we've got go to the GP or go to A&E as broadly the only options, and you need something close to the communities. Mental health needs to be catered for. So we're talking about a model that will survive for generations to come, not just a slightly better health service at the end of 5 or more years of a Labour government.
Right, and then obviously if you want to make use of the technology, you've got to build the right digital infrastructure and so on and so forth. That is also really important.
You've got to do all that, but you've also got to take on those that say leave it as it is.
Yeah,
because you will all, particularly in public services.
But here's the thing that I found most difficult, I think you find difficult as well. And that is the tendency on the progressive side of politics to define radical simply by the amount of money you're prepared to commit.
Yeah, and this is a big mistake. So I ran a public service for 5 years, the Crown Prosecution Service. I don't need persuading that if you put a bit of money in the top, you get a better outcome. But I absolutely know to get a much better outcome, you've got to reform. You've got to take the difficult decisions. And people will say, no, it's pretty good, don't rock the boat, don't change anything, it all works as it is. But you've got to reform. And an example from when I was running the Crown Prosecution Service, the first thing I did was to go around the country to all of our offices to try and learn what our staff were doing on the ground. And I remember it was a sort of freezing cold January day, and I was in South Wales, and we're in the office, and this van pulled up, and then into which were loaded lots and lots of papers, and then it set off over the mountain to the Crown Court for the next day. And when it was en route, one of the cases got switched to a different court, a sort of reverse and go in a different direction. And I said, what is this? And they said, oh, all our files are paper files. I said, well, you must be able to surely move this electronically. No. We've always done it this way. And so we've got to make use of the technology, we've got to win the argument, but we've also got to win people over to the idea that this is what is necessary.
Right, that science and technology will be critical to the future. So, Keir, we only a short time left. The Labour leader is always in receipt of an inexhaustible supply of advice on how to lose an election. So, the thing that's most difficult, I always think when because your people, the difference is sort of, when you're in the Conservative Party, you kind of think, right, it's your divine right to govern, so it's, you just get on with it.
Yeah.
Okay? I mean, I think they're a bit different now, but with the Labour Party, the people want this sense of enthusiasm. They want to be enthusiastic about what they're going to do. I mean, when you look back, the other difference between us is that I was lucky enough to have Neil Kinnock and John Smith before me. You weren't, right? So, put it like that. So I just want in the last bit, because people should acknowledge what you have done since 2019, because I tell you, it was not easy. In the closing minute, how was it done?
I just pick you up on your interest. I mean, we're trying to do Kinnock, Smith and Blair in one run, and to do it in 5 years. And that has meant we've had to go at pace. And it meant we've had to be really ruthless and tough. We couldn't, you know, along the way, when we got to difficult decisions, people have said to me, don't do it this year, Keir. Leave it, we'll do it at conference next year. And we've had to go at this at pace because we haven't got the time to waste on this. And every day I remind myself that to get from where we landed in 2019 to a one-seat Labour majority, is going to take a bigger swing than 1997. And if that doesn't sober, I often talk about politics as sort of sharp intake of breath. That gives me a sharp intake of breath every time I say it because people are inhaling the polls, and that is a big, big, big mistake. But there are then just fundamental, so the first thing we had to do was change the party. And I don't know whether this is because I came into politics later in life, etc., but when you lose that badly, I strongly believe you don't look at the electorate and say, what on earth were you doing? Didn't you listen to us? Should we shout a bit louder? You look in the mirror and say, we got this wrong. We've got to change as a party, and we had to change as a party at speed. I also felt strongly that we didn't really have the right to say how we'd run the country until we'd done the change. People were not going to listen to the Labour Party until we showed we had changed and changed for a good purpose. The second bit was then, and we had to be really unrelenting on that, really clear, difficult decisions, and change is never finished. But we got as far as then the next stage, which is to expose the government as not fit to govern. Now, we've been ably assisted in that, I have to admit, by the last three prime ministers. And now we get to that place of, well, if not them, then why you? But this is where, you know, because all along the way I've had the advice, you know, when we're at the stage of we've got to change the party, there are people yelling from the sidelines saying, where's your vision? Go bolder, go bigger. And I said, we've got to fix the party first. We've got to change the party first. So there will be people all along the journey telling you to do it in a different order, but we had to do it in that order. But now we get the chance to lay out the change that an incoming Labour government would put. But if we hadn't changed the party, it would be as naught, because I strongly think that the electorate don't usually look to change the government if they're pretty happy with it, if things are all right. But when they think it's not all right, actually, I've had enough of you lot, I want some change, and I think we're at that moment, then there's a laser focus in, well, what's the alternative then? And if we hadn't changed the Labour Party, then they'd be looking at us and saying, nah, we're not going to do that. So that's why the next stage is where we've got to be even tougher, even more focused, even more disciplined. And I've said to the Shadow Cabinet and others, to get this over the line at the next general election, we've got to be exceptional over the period that we've got left between now and that general election.
Well, you know, if how far you've taken the Labour Party in the last 4 years as any guide to how far you can take the country, will be in good hands. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Roxy. Really appreciate that.
Yep. Thanks, Keir. Really, thank you very much. Thank you. Right. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. It's been absolutely wonderful to have you here. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've got something out of it. We have been absolutely honoured to have you with us. Have a great rest of the day, rest of the year, and who knows, next year, be even more exciting. Thank you very much.
using about 30 different times on my phone.
That's right. In the next few minutes, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, will be up on stage here. Theoretically, was due to brief journalists on another matter to do with Ukraine, but that will be a hot topic here. The US Army have confirmed, or the military in North Korea have, within the last 10-15 minutes, confirmed that a US service member has crossed without authorization, willfully and without authorization, said, into the military demarcation line. Now, this is fairly serious, of course. Our CBS partners in the US have heard from witnesses who described the man as having gone in between buildings and laughing, saying ha ha ha, details of which are due to be announced quite shortly, including the identification which our US partner CBS have indeed already identified